Celeste Mercer laughed when the old sedan pulled up in front of the hotel. After a night of being cornered by her board into a deal that stripped her of power, the drunk CEO stepped through the lobby doors and fixed the driver in the faded jacket with open contempt. "You sure this is my ride home and not something headed for the salvage yard?" Grayson Locke said nothing. He simply opened the rear door, handed her water, and drove her through the rain. But when the car stopped at the Mercer estate and Celeste's mother stepped onto the front steps, the woman went pale. "Grayson," she whispered. "My son-in-law." Stay until the end to find out why a mother recognized the single dad driver her own daughter had just mocked. The Aurelian Hotel stood at the edge of Chicago's financial district like a monument to deals done in dim light. And on a Thursday night in late November, every table in its ballroom had been dressed in white linen for a gathering that was not a celebration but a surrender dressed up in champagne. Celeste Mercer, 36 years old and CEO of Mercer Industries for the past 4 years, had walked into that hotel believing she still held the wheel, and she had spent 3 hours watching it get pried from her hands one course at a time. The board had been patient, Vaughn Mercer had been charming, and Garrett Holloway had been precise, as he always was when he was burying something important beneath language, so careful it barely left fingerprints. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, an amendment had been placed in front of Celeste with the quiet suggestion that her signature that evening would reassure the investors. An amendment that, had she signed, would have transferred operational oversight of Mercer's core manufacturing assets to a subsidiary committee whose composition Vaughn had spent 6 months carefully engineering. Celeste did not sign. She ordered another glass of wine and sat with the particular loneliness of a person who has just realized that the people applauding her across the table have been planning her exit for longer than she has been in the room. Vaughn leaned down as he passed and told her to sleep on it, his voice carrying just enough warmth to make the threat feel almost like advice. Garrett was already by the door, one hand on his overcoat and the other on his phone, moving on to whatever came next. Celeste's personal driver sent a message at 11 claiming a family emergency. She would later understand that was not a coincidence. Her assistant had been called away hours earlier to manage a filing crisis that had also been manufactured. The people who had surrounded her all evening were gone before she had fully processed that they were leaving. By 11:30, Celeste Mercer was standing under the hotel's stone awning in the beginning of a cold Chicago rain, heels damp, trying to book a car on her phone with fingers that were not entirely cooperating. When the black sedan finally appeared and pulled toward her with the unhurried calm of a car that had no reason to rush, she squinted at it from beneath the awning and felt something in her chest that she was too proud to name as relief. The car was older than she expected, a practical vehicle in deep gray, with a small crack in the corner of the driver's side mirror that she noticed immediately, because Celeste Mercer noticed the things that told her what she was dealing with. The driver stepped out into the light rain without a hood, a tall man with dark hair and a jacket that had been good once, confirmed her name in a voice that was unhurried and polite, and held the rear door with the steady courtesy of someone who did not need to impress anyone. Celeste looked at the car. She looked at the man. Then she said loudly enough that a passing doorman could hear it, "You sure this is my ride home and not something headed for the salvage yard?" The driver's expression did not change. His name was Grayson Locke. He was 39 years old. He had been awake since 6 that morning fixing a transmission in a shop on the north side, and he had 3 more hours left on his shift before he could go home to his daughter. He said nothing. He held the door open. He waited. Celeste got in. The city moved past the rain-streaked windows in blurred gold and red as Grayson headed northwest toward the Langston estate, where Celeste's mother kept the house Celeste had grown up in and where, on nights that went wrong in the particular way that money could not fix, Celeste still sometimes went. She had not told Grayson why she was going to her mother's rather than her own penthouse, but she had given the address without explanation, which Grayson understood as a kind of answer by itself. He kept the heater running low, set a sealed bottle of water in the cup holder where she could reach it, and settled into the quiet without filling it with anything unnecessary. Celeste sat in the back with her heels off and her arms crossed and the look of a person who had been handed a defeat she was not yet ready to acknowledge but could not pretend away either. She asked him how long he had been driving. He told her a few years. She asked if he did anything else. He said he worked on cars during the day. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a scoff but lived somewhere between the two, and said that at least people in his line of work got to fail in private, without a room full of investors watching. The sentence began as cruelty and finished as something more complicated, because even Celeste heard the grief in it by the time she reached the end. Grayson said nothing, kept his eyes on the road, and slowed carefully as the tires hit a stretch of wet pavement near an overpass. She told him he would not understand what it meant to have an entire company threatened, one her father had spent 30 years building, by people who had been eating at her table all year. She said it with the conviction of someone who has only ever lived in one kind of world and cannot imagine that any other kind has its own version of loss. Grayson did not argue. He noted the turn onto Lakeshore coming up, checked his mirror, and said quietly that most people who worked nights understood something about protecting what they had built, even if what they had built did not have a board of directors. Celeste heard it and chose not to respond, which meant she had heard it more clearly than she wanted to. The phone in the cup holder lit up. The name on the screen was Piper. Grayson glanced at it once, then back at the road, and did not answer because he was driving and because he had a rule he kept without needing to explain it to anyone. Celeste saw the name and said, with the particular edge that alcohol gave to things already sharp, that she hoped his daughter knew her father spent his nights driving women like her through the rain at midnight. Grayson did not react in the way she was expecting. He did not tighten his grip on the wheel or let anything cold into his voice. He simply said, "My daughter knows I go out every night to come home to her." The simplicity of it landed in the back seat without ceremony, and Celeste sat with it for a moment before she covered the quiet with more words she did not entirely mean. She said something about money and proximity to real life, and the way certain people spent their entire existence outside the sphere where anything consequential happened. Grayson waited until she finished, and then said, without inflection and without malice, "Sometimes the people outside that sphere see it more clearly than the ones living inside it." Celeste made a short, humorless sound and called it cheap philosophy from a man driving a car with a cracked mirror. But the words had settled in her somewhere, below the wine and the anger, in a place that would not be quiet until the night was finished. The gates of the Langston estate appeared ahead at the end of a long private drive, its stone pillars lit from below, and Grayson eased the sedan toward the entrance. Celeste sat up, reflexively straightening, out of habit or pride or both. Grayson brought the car to a stop inside the stone gate, stepped out, and opened the door for Celeste with the same steady courtesy he had maintained all evening. She took the hand he offered because the pavement was damp and her heels were off, and she was not willing to fall in front of her mother's house. He pressed the intercom, stepped back, and was already turning toward the car when the front door opened. Meredith Langston came down the stone steps in a dark wrap she had pulled on in a hurry, her silver hair loose, and her expression carrying the particular tension that was equal parts relief and reproach. She had been awake for hours watching the window, because Celeste had stopped answering her phone at 10 and Meredith had learned long ago that silence after midnight was never simple. She was halfway across the drive before she looked past Celeste, and then she stopped. She stopped as if the ground had shifted, not in the way of someone who stumbles, but in the way of someone who has just seen a face that belongs to a closed and locked part of their life standing unexpectedly under the porch light. Her eyes moved across Grayson's face slowly, and then dropped to his neckline, where a thin chain disappeared beneath the collar of his jacket. The breath went out of her in something that was not quite a sound. "Grayson," she said. The name came out barely above a whisper, the way a person says something they have rehearsed in private for years, without ever expecting to say it aloud. Grayson went still. He knew the name Langston the way a man knows the address of a house he has never been allowed inside. From the outside only, a name Marissa had said once or twice, always with a particular set of the shoulders that meant she was carrying something she had decided not to put down. He had seen one photograph, a small one Marissa kept at the bottom of a shoebox. The woman in that photograph had been younger, but the bone structure was the same, and the way she was looking at him now, with the grief of someone seeing a door they had shut standing open in the dark, confirmed what his mind had already begun to assemble. Celeste asked sharply what was happening. Meredith stepped closer to Grayson, looked at the chain at his collar, and said very quietly, "You still wear it." Grayson reached up and closed his fingers around the shape beneath his shirt, the edge of a ring on the chain, plain gold, nothing elaborate. He nodded once. Meredith turned to her daughter then, and the expression on her face was one Celeste had never seen before. Not the careful composure her mother wore in public, or the private worry she wore at home, but something older and rawer than either, something that had been held in a closed room for a very long time. "Before I answer that," Meredith said, "come inside, both of you." Grayson said he was just a driver and had delivered his passengers safely and ought to be going. Meredith reached out and held his forearm with both hands, not restraining him, just holding on. "Please," she said, "just a few minutes. I need to know about Piper." The name landed like a stone in still water. Celeste looked at her mother and did not recognize the word but felt its weight. For the first time since she had walked out of that hotel with her shoes in her hand and her pride in pieces, Celeste Mercer went quiet. "Before everything else," Meredith said, with the kind of steadiness that costs everything a person has, "you should know that before you, I had another daughter." The sitting room of the Langston estate was the kind of room that had been arranged once and never changed, full of objects that witnessed things and said nothing about them. Celeste sat with a mug of black coffee she did not want, but kept her hands wrapped around anyway, because it gave her something to hold, while the understanding that she had spent her entire life missing a significant piece of her own story settled into her slowly. Grayson sat near the window, jacket still on, watching Meredith with the attention of someone who had spent years wondering what this conversation would look like. Meredith told it plainly. Marissa Boone had been born when Meredith was 24, before the Mercer marriage, before the estate and the careful management of appearances that came with the name. When Meredith married into the Mercer family, Vaughn made the situation clear in the way powerful men in old families make things clear, not with explicit threats, but with the pressure of expectation and the implication of what would be lost if Marissa were acknowledged. Meredith had told herself it was temporary, that she would find a way to keep both parts of her life intact, and she had kept telling herself that until the temporary became permanent and the damage became a shape she had to live inside. Marissa had not disappeared quietly. She had grown up smart and precise and angry in the specific way of people who understand what was done to them and have decided to do something with that understanding. She studied corporate law, joined Mercer Industries under the surname Boone to avoid recognition, and spent 2 years in the legal department before anyone thought to ask where she came from. It was there that she met Grayson Locke, who had a contract doing restoration work on the company's vintage fleet, a man of unremarkable exterior and considerable interior quality. They married quietly, with no Mercer family present, because by then Marissa had begun to understand what Vaughn was doing with certain financial structures and had decided that distance from the family name was a matter of safety. Piper arrived the following year, small and bright, and entirely unaware that she had been born into a family already managing which version of its history was allowed to exist. Grayson spoke when Meredith paused. He said Marissa had not been bitter about Celeste personally. She had told him once that Celeste had grown up inside the same silence that Marissa had grown up outside of, and that both of them had been shaped by what the family chose not to say. But Marissa was clear about what she did feel: anger at the machinery of silence that Vaughn and Garrett had built to protect Mercer's image at the cost of the people who could not protect themselves within it. That anger had spent years becoming evidence. Before the illness took her, she assembled everything she found into a single container and left it with Grayson in a wooden box, with instructions to open it. Only when the day arrived that Celeste ran out of road inside a company quietly undermining her. Looking at Celeste now, at the coffee mug and the ruined evening, and the look of someone who had just learned the shape of the floor she had been standing on, Grayson understood that day had arrived. Celeste set down her mug, started to speak, and could not finish the sentence. Grayson said, "You didn't know. That's the only reason I'm still sitting here." The following morning was gray and still. Grayson's house was in a quiet working neighborhood on the north side, a narrow two-story with a side entrance to the garage where his tools hung in a clean and precise order that said something about how he thought even when no one was observing. Piper was already dressed when Celeste and Meredith arrived, a careful, self-possessed 8-year-old who greeted them with the measured politeness of a child taught to be warm but not unguarded. A neighbor appeared at the back door to walk her to school, and Piper went without drama, pausing only to tell her father she had not eaten the crusts of her toast, and they were still on the counter in case he wanted them. After she left, the house was quiet in the way it is quiet when a child has just walked out, still shaped by her, in the light on the table and the small backpack hook by the door. Grayson went to the hall closet and returned with a wooden box, the kind a person keeps when they do not want to lose something, but cannot bear to look at it every day. He set it on the kitchen table, cut the sealed tape with a utility knife, and stood back. The letter on top was written in the careful, slightly compressed hand of someone trained in legal drafting who had chosen, in this document, to write like a person rather than a professional. It was addressed to Celeste, written in the second person as if speaking directly across the years to a sister she had never met. The first line read, "If you are reading this, then they have done to you what they once did to me, and you finally know there was someone here before you who tried to stop it." Below the letter were printed email chains showing exchanges between Garrett Holloway and a law firm Mercer officially had no relationship with, detailing the architecture of a financial maneuver designed to transfer Mercer's most valuable assets through transactions that would appear to be routine operational restructuring. The trigger for the transfer was described as a governance event, a term that Delaney Brooks, Celeste's attorney, recognized immediately upon arriving within the hour as language for the moment when a CEO was under sufficient pressure to sign without fully understanding what she was signing. Delaney worked through the materials methodically. The deal Celeste had been pressured to sign at the hotel was structurally identical to the template in Marissa's files. The subsidiary designated to receive the assets appeared nowhere in Mercer's official records, and Marissa had traced the beneficial ownership through 2 holding companies to an account Vaughn controlled through a trust. Grayson mentioned Brielle Dawson, a former archive employee who had quietly retained copies of key email chains when Marissa was forced out, unwilling to let them disappear. Celeste looked at the documents, then at Grayson, and said she was not going to sign. Grayson said that was what Marissa had been hoping for. There is a particular clarity that comes the morning after a bad night, when the alcohol is gone and what was softened by it has hardened back into its actual shape. Celeste returned to her mother's house, showered, changed into clothes without an occasion attached to them, and sat at the kitchen table with water and aspirin and the specific discomfort of a person who remembers clearly everything they said and cannot pretend otherwise. She was not, as a rule, someone who said things she did not mean. What she had said to Grayson in the car was worse than that. She had said things she had believed in the moment, things she had absorbed from a world that sorted people by the cars they drove and the suits they wore and the way they pronounced the names of wine regions, and she had deployed them against a man she did not know in the worst hour of his quiet and dignified private life. Meredith sat across from her, and for a while neither of them spoke in any meaningful way. Then Celeste asked her mother, without anger and without softness, how she had let it happen, how a person allowed a child to be removed from their life, as though that child were an inconvenience to be managed rather than a human being to be loved. Meredith answered as honestly as she could, which meant saying things that were not comfortable, that she had been afraid, that the Mercer name had felt like the only safe ground available to her at the time, that she had told herself Marissa was strong and would be fine, and had kept telling herself that long after it stopped being true. She said she had not gone to the hospital during Marissa's final months because, by then, she had been afraid of what Marissa would say to her, and that fear had cost her the last chance she had. Celeste listened and understood in the way that understanding sometimes arrives as a cold weight rather than a revelation, that she had been trained by the same system, the contempt she had carried into Grayson's car the night before. The casual confidence that her suffering was the important kind, that his world was less real than hers. That was not something she had invented. It was something she had been taught, carefully and consistently, by a family that had built its entire identity on the premise that some people's losses mattered more than others. She called Grayson from the kitchen, and when he answered, she spoke without preparation. She told him she was sorry, and she went through it specifically. Sorry for the remark about the salvage yard, sorry for what she had implied about his work, sorry for the remark about Piper that had been designed to wound and had succeeded, sorry for the entire framework of dismissal she had brought into that car. She said she understood if an apology changed nothing, but she wanted him to hear it clearly, rather than as a social formality. Grayson was quiet for a moment, and then he said that apologies were only useful if they were accompanied by a genuine willingness to hear what they were apologizing for, meaning not just the words in the car, but the thing those words had come from and what it had done to people who had no recourse against it. Celeste said she did not want to use Marissa's story to make herself look better. She said she wanted to understand what her sister had carried alone for years. After another pause, Grayson said he would take her to find Brielle Dawson. Brielle Dawson worked out of a small records management firm in the West Loop, a company that did the unglamorous and necessary work of maintaining legal archives for businesses that could not afford the infrastructure to do it in-house. She was a compact, watchful woman in her early 40s who had the look of someone who had spent a long time around large institutions and had learned not to be impressed by the size of them. When Celeste and Grayson and Delaney appeared at her office, she looked at Celeste with an expression that said she knew exactly who this was and had not yet decided how she felt about it. She said she had heard Marissa's name in the context of Mercer Industries exactly once since leaving the company, and that had been in a legal notice informing her that her employment records were being archived, which she had understood at the time as a message about what happened to people who remembered too much. Grayson placed the storage drive from Marissa's box on the desk in front of her. Brielle looked at it for a long moment, then picked it up and turned it over, and on the reverse side there was a small symbol, a sequence of 3 lines, and a dot that meant nothing to anyone else in the room, but that Brielle recognized immediately, because it was the file organization shorthand Marissa had used across all the private archiving she had done outside the official system. Brielle set the drive down and pressed both hands flat on the desk and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a person looks when something has arrived that they thought they would never see. "I thought Garrett had gotten everything," she said. She had her own decryption process because Marissa had given her the key years earlier in a conversation that Brielle had understood was being conducted by someone who knew they might not have an unlimited number of conversations left. The drive opened to reveal a structured archive, 7 folders labeled by date range, each containing a combination of email chains, internal memos, and scanned documents. Brielle moved through them methodically, and what she described over the following 90 minutes was a record of institutional betrayal assembled by a single person working alone in the evenings in a company that employed hundreds of lawyers. The emails showed Garrett directing the construction of an acquisition framework designed to appear as an operational decision while actually serving as a mechanism for transferring Mercer's highest value assets to a receiving entity that Vaughn controlled. The document template Garrett had prepared for the trigger event was almost word-for-word identical to the agreement Celeste had been handed at the hotel the previous night. The company meant to receive the transferred assets was the same entity Marissa had traced in her files, still active, still incorporated under the same name. Brielle's own copies confirmed a final piece. There had been an internal compliance report, filed several years earlier by a junior officer, that had flagged the subsidiary structure as a potential conflict of interest. That report had been buried in an ARC folder that was then mislabeled during a system migration, which Brielle was certain had not been an accident. "Marissa told me once," Brielle said quietly, looking at neither Grayson nor Celeste, but at some middle distance that held the memory of the conversation, that if Celeste ever woke up, she should be given the chance to hear the truth. Celeste sat very still. She had expected resentment from everyone in this room. She had not expected that. Word reached Vaughn Mercer that his niece had not signed the agreement and was meeting with an unspecified driver and an attorney. He was not a man who needed much detail to understand a direction, and the direction this was pointing was one he recognized immediately as a problem. He had Garrett make inquiries, and within several hours Garrett had the name Grayson Locke. And when Garrett heard that name, he went the particular kind of quiet that people go when they have encountered something they believed was safely buried. He told Vaughn that Locke had been Marissa Boone's husband. Vaughn asked how long Marissa had been dead. "Long enough," Garrett said, "that the files should have been unreachable." "Should have been," Vaughn repeated. They moved quickly in the way that people move when carefully designed machinery begins to come apart at a previously invisible seam. Photographs appeared in 3 separate outlets that covered the kind of story that was not quite news but could be positioned to look like it. Grayson opening the car door for Celeste outside the hotel, Grayson at the gate of the Langston estate at midnight, Grayson's profile against the light. The framing was not explicit. It did not need to be. The language around the photographs was enough. Phrases like late-night companion and mystery driver and sources close to the Mercer board that were designed to create an association and let people manufacture the rest. The story was not about Grayson's character. It was about Celeste's judgment and about the implied foolishness of a CEO who had been caught in some kind of compromising entanglement with a man who drove a car with a cracked mirror. Grayson was angry, not in a loud or demonstrative way, but in the way of someone who has spent years building a life that is clean and straightforward and knows exactly what that kind of story can do to a child who has to go to school. Celeste was angry in a way she now recognized. This was how the family had always operated when someone with evidence got too close, and for the first time she understood it as a pattern because she had now seen it applied to two different women in her own family. Meredith Langston, who had spent 30 years choosing silence as a form of self-preservation, did something that cost her in the exact way she had always been afraid of being cost. She issued a short written statement through her personal attorney that said simply, "Grayson Locke is the surviving spouse of my daughter Marissa Boone, who passed away several years ago, and the father of my granddaughter. He is family." The statement was precise and contained no accusations, but its effect was immediate because it rerouted every question. The story was no longer about what Grayson's presence meant to Celeste's reputation. The question was now why Meredith Langston had never publicly acknowledged a daughter, and why that daughter's widower had been cast as a villain within 48 hours of contacting the Mercer family. Vaughn lost the initiative, but he still had the board meeting scheduled, and he still had a room full of people he had spent months preparing. Delaney was drafting an emergency filing. Brielle was organizing the documentation. Grayson sat with the question of whether Marissa's name, which he had protected carefully and quietly for years, was about to become the center of something large and public. Meredith said to him in the kitchen of her house with her hands around a cup of tea, "Keeping her hidden was what hurt her. I won't do it again." The board convened on a Friday morning in the Mercer Industries executive conference room. A room designed to make the people sitting in it feel like decisions made there were the natural consequence of order rather than of power and arrangement. Vaughn had arrived early. Garrett had the documents laid out. The agenda called for a formal vote to ratify the agreement Celeste had not signed at the hotel, and there were 7 members present who had been guided toward a favorable disposition by Vaughn's particular combination of influence and implied consequence. Celeste walked in with Delaney at her side, Meredith behind her, and Grayson, who had asked twice whether his presence served a purpose, and had been told both times by Celeste that it did. The room registered each arrival carefully, Delaney as an adversarial quantity, Meredith as an unexpected complication, and Grayson as something requiring a second look from everyone who had seen the photographs that morning. Celeste did not sit when she reached her chair. She set a photograph face-up on the table at the center. A small one from Marissa's box, showing a woman at a desk looking at a document with the concentration of someone making sure she had not missed anything. Then she pulled the chair to her left away from the table and left it empty, and said, "Before this meeting begins, the people in this room should know who first tried to stop what is on today's agenda." Vaughn said family matters had no bearing on a governance vote. Delaney replied that Marissa Boone had been a member of Mercer's legal department for 2 years, that she had documented the transaction structure currently before the board, and that her analysis had been suppressed and her employment terminated through a process Garrett had managed, specifically designed to protect the arrangement they were gathered to ratify. Brielle opened her laptop and walked the room through the documents in order, from the earliest email, establishing the framework to the most recent version of the agreement, demonstrating their structural continuity. Several board members who had been oriented toward Vaughn's position leaned forward. Not all of them had fully understood what they were ratifying, and understanding it now, with a compliance professional in the room and a name on a piece of paper on the table, changed the calculation. Meredith spoke briefly. She said Vaughn had told her years ago that acknowledging Marissa would harm the family and the company, and that she had believed him, and that both her daughter and her company had come close to destruction as a result of what she had allowed him to build in the name of protection. When a board member asked Grayson why he had kept Marissa's files for so many years, he answered without hesitation, "Because my wife is not here to walk into this room herself, so I held the door open until someone could." No one spoke. The photograph on the table, the empty chair, Celeste's hands flat in front of her. The room held all of it. Celeste declined to sign. Delaney submitted a formal request for an independent investigation into the conflict of interest represented by Vaughn's beneficial ownership of the entity designated to receive the transferred assets. 3 of the 7 board members indicated they would not vote to ratify under current conditions. The ratification failed. Vaughn Mercer sat very still at the far end of the table and said nothing at all, which was, in its own way, a kind of admission. Delaney filed the emergency petition with the circuit court on Friday afternoon, and by Monday a temporary restraining order had been granted, prohibiting any further transfer or encumbrance of Mercer's core manufacturing assets for 60 days pending investigation. The independent investigator appointed by the court was a forensic accounting firm with no prior relationship with Mercer, and it began its work methodically and without theater. Within 3 weeks, the beneficial ownership structure that Marissa had traced through 2 holding companies had been independently verified. The receiving entity, incorporated under a name that suggested a regional real estate concern, listed Vaughn's Trust as its primary beneficiary through a chain of intermediate vehicles that Garrett had designed with the specific intention of ensuring that nothing visible in any single document pointed directly to Vaughn. It had been a careful design, but documents designed to survive scrutiny in isolation are different from documents that must survive scrutiny as a sequence, and Marissa had spent 2 years assembling the sequence. Grayson provided the court-appointed investigator with a full inventory of the materials in Marissa's box, including the handwritten notes she had kept as a personal log during the period when she had been under pressure to stop her internal inquiry. The notes did not describe dramatic confrontations. They described incremental pressure applied through institutional mechanisms, access to certain filing systems quietly revoked, her annual review moved up and conducted by Garrett personally, her health coverage classified as provisional pending a compliance review that had no legitimate basis, and a meeting in which she was told through carefully constructed implication that her husband's business license could be subject to challenges if she continued. She had written at the bottom of one entry, "This is not a fight they conduct with threats. They fight it by making every ordinary thing in your life suddenly uncertain." Celeste read those notes at 2 in the morning in her own apartment and sat with them for a long time. The system she had inherited had done this to a woman who was her own sister, had dismantled Marissa's ordinary life, piece by piece in exchange for silence, and had done it efficiently enough that Celeste had run the company for 4 years without knowing Marissa had ever existed. She was not the architect of that system, but she had occupied it and benefited from it and accepted its version of events without question, and that was a different kind of responsibility than conspiracy, but it was still a responsibility. Vaughn Mercer was suspended from all board committees pending the conclusion of the investigation. Garrett Holloway tendered his resignation from his advisory role and retained his own counsel. The deal was formally voided. The subsidiary structure was unwound. In the internal statement Celeste sent to the company's leadership the following week, she acknowledged that a former member of Mercer's legal team had identified these risks years earlier and had been dismissed rather than heard, and that this outcome was one the company owed it to that person to take seriously. The statement named Marissa Boone. It was the first time that name had appeared in an official Mercer document. Meredith, reading it on her phone in her sitting room, folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes for a very long time. Celeste went to the garage on a Tuesday afternoon without a driver or an assistant or any of the usual architecture of her professional life. Grayson was working beneath a lifted coupe when she arrived, visible only as a pair of boots and a pair of hands from under the frame, and she stood near the entrance taking in the space, the tools on their hooks, the clean concrete floor, the low radio playing a country station, the cup of coffee on the workbench that had gone cold and had not been finished because he had not had a moment to return to it. The old sedan was parked along the back wall. Celeste looked at it for a long time without looking away. Grayson came out from under the lift, saw her, and stood without ceremony or coldness. He wiped his hands on a shop cloth. Celeste said she was sorry again, and this time she went through it, item by item. The remark about the salvage yard, the implications about his livelihood, the remark about Piper, the entire framework of dismissal she had brought into that car that had not been about him specifically, but had landed on him completely. She said she understood that a second apology following a first one could start to look like a performance, and that she was not interested in it looking like that, which was why she was in a garage, rather than sending an assistant with a note. Grayson listened without interrupting. He said he had not expected the first apology, and was not sure what to do with the second one, but that what Celeste chose to do going forward mattered considerably more than any number of apologies delivered in the abstract. He said Marissa had spent 2 years trying to change something from inside a system that responded to internal pressure by removing the person applying it, and the single thing she had told him she hoped for, in the quiet way she had of saying the important things, was that the company she had loved might eventually function in a way that made what happened to her less possible for someone else. Celeste told him about the fund she had decided to establish, a legal support structure for employees reporting financial misconduct, specifically designed to protect those employees from the kind of institutional pressure that had been used against Marissa. She said it would be named the Marissa Boone Legal Integrity Fund, not as a gesture but because the name belonged in that context and had been absent from it for too long. Grayson said nothing for a moment. Then he said he had one condition, which was that if the fund was going to carry Marissa's name, it had to be built on what Marissa had actually believed in, and not on what made the company look good in a statement. Celeste said she understood the difference. Grayson nodded. He did not ask for compensation or recognition or anything that could be converted into currency. He asked only that the records show Marissa had been right. Meredith arrived at Grayson's house on a Sunday morning carrying a cardboard box, the kind a person brings when they are trying to offer something real and have thought carefully about what real looks like in practice. There were no large gifts, no elaborate peace offerings, no currency-based attempt to compress years of absence into a single afternoon. The box contained photographs. Marissa at 10 years old, Marissa at 17 before a high school debate competition, Marissa in her law school graduation gown, Marissa in the small apartment she had lived in during the years when she was working out who she was, and the Mercer name was not available to her as an identity. Meredith had kept them in a locked drawer for years, taking them out occasionally in private and then putting them back because looking at them was the only form of contact she had allowed herself. Grayson let her in. Piper was at the kitchen table finishing a drawing and looked up with the frank evaluative interest of an 8-year-old who has been told a new person is coming and has formed her own preliminary assessment. Grayson introduced Meredith simply as the mother of Piper's mother, which was as accurate and uncomplicated as it was possible to be. Piper studied Meredith for a moment with the same eyes her mother had had, the particular shade of brown that Grayson had spent 8 years watching move across the same face in a smaller form. Then Piper asked if the box had pictures in it. Meredith opened it. They looked at the photographs together at the kitchen table, Piper and Meredith, with Grayson standing in the doorway watching and not yet trusting himself to join them. Piper found a photograph of Marissa at roughly her own age, gap-toothed and squinting into the sun, and held it up next to her own face for Meredith to compare. Meredith said, with a steadiness that cost her something visible, that the resemblance was remarkable. Piper said she knew, because her father had always told her so. She said it the way children state things that adults have been carefully tiptoeing around, as plain fact. Meredith told Grayson quietly that she would understand if he felt her reappearance was too late and too little to be welcomed, and that she would accept whatever conditions he chose to set. He said she could not undo anything, and that he had not brought Piper up expecting anyone on the Langston side to appear, so there was no particular place in the architecture of their life that Meredith was designed to fill. But there was room, if she wanted to be present and consistent and patient, and consistent was the important word. She said she understood. Celeste arrived toward the end of the morning, having underestimated how long it would take to find the address. She came in quietly and stood near the kitchen door, unsure of how to enter a scene already underway. Piper looked up from the photographs and assessed her. "Are you the lady who was drunk in my dad's car?" Celeste said yes. Piper said her father had mentioned that, and that the lady had said something unkind about the car. Celeste confirmed it, and said she was working on becoming a better version of herself than the one from that night. Piper considered this for a moment and then said, "You should probably apologize to the car, too." Celeste laughed, the first laugh in days that had nothing difficult attached to it. She walked across the kitchen, stepped through the open side door into the garage, placed her hand on the hood of the old sedan, and said, "I'm sorry, you got me where I needed to go." Several months later, Mercer Industries released its findings publicly. Vaughn Mercer removed from all leadership positions pending civil proceedings. Garrett Holloway facing a civil suit on multiple counts of conflict of interest and document suppression, the subsidiary structure formally dissolved, and the governance framework under comprehensive revision by an independent oversight committee that included, for the first time, a seat designated for an employee advocate without board affiliation. Celeste had insisted on that last part. She had insisted on several other things the remaining board members were not entirely comfortable with, and she had made her position on their discomfort clear. The internal announcement was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and Celeste had written most of it herself over a series of late evenings, rejecting several drafts because they began with financial performance or strategic positioning. The final version began with Marissa Boone's name. It described what Marissa had found, what she had tried to do with it, and what it had cost her. It described, without euphemism, the systems that had made it possible to silence a person who had been right. It said that the standard for this company going forward was not the one that had allowed that to happen. Grayson sat at the back of the room, not introduced, not listed, not asked to speak. This had been his condition. Meredith sat 3 rows ahead of him, next to the empty aisle seat where she had placed Marissa's photograph in its frame, face forward, resting against the back of the chair. Piper was at school. She would learn about what her mother had done when she was old enough to carry it as history rather than burden. After the room cleared, Celeste found Grayson at the back and said she was taking the rest of the day away from the building and had asked her regular car service to cancel. She asked if he was taking any rides that afternoon. He said he had driven Meredith over, and once the afternoon finished, he was taking her and Piper home. Celeste said she did not need to ride along. Grayson said there was room. They walked out together into the gray November air, and the old sedan was parked at the curb below the front steps, exactly where a car like that always was, not announced, not decorated, just there and equal to whatever was required of it. Celeste stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at it. Then Grayson said, "Front seat is open, if you want it." Celeste opened the door and got in. On the drive across town, she watched the city go past the window the way she had on that first night, but this time in daylight, and this time in silence that was not uncomfortable, and this time knowing the road they had already traveled. She said, "That night, I thought you were just driving me home." Grayson kept his eyes on the road and answered, "No. I was driving you toward the truth that was waiting for you." and the old sedan moved through the late-morning streets of Chicago, carrying a woman who had once laughed at it from a hotel awning, back through the city, back through everything the night had cost, and everything the months had returned, back into a life that was smaller and more honest and considerably more real than the one she had climbed into that first rainy night when she looked at a cracked mirror and a faded jacket and thought she already knew everything about the man behind the wheel.